The financial crisis of early 1770s had prompted the British Parliament to intervene in EIC's affairs in India. It was hoped that with the Regulating Act of 1773, East India Company will put its house in order. But more than a decade later, when Governor General Warren Hastings resigned, the major expectations were not met. The revenue scene of East India Company was still dismal, with all of Hastings' experiments failing. The issue of bribes and corruption had not been resolved, and a person no less than Hastings himself faced a lot of allegations. In terms of wars, although East India Company did not lose, but it also did not win anything significant during this period. All of this led to a thought in London that somebody from outside of the East India Company's ecosystem must now be sent to get things in line. Somebody who was a strong-headed person who could give the backbone of British governance system here in India. Somebody who was also a competent military leader who could take on the challenges arising from Indian princes. Somebody who was so efficient that he would reorganize the entire administrative structure of India. And in that context, the eyes fell on one man, and that was Lord Cornwallis. Lord Cornwallis, who had nothing to do with East India Company earlier, was seen as the appropriate person for taking the charge of Governor General of Bengal after Warren Hastings. Now, Lord Cornwallis had a resume that matched the descriptions for this job. He had a track record that made him the most suitable candidate for this purpose. He came from a blue-blooded aristocratic line, a person who was very highly respected in Britain. He had fought in several wars for his motherland, may it be the 7 Years' War or later in the American War of Independence. In all of these wars, he had fought with distinction and was known as a man of great courage and integrity. Although, yes, under his charge, the Americans had surrendered, the British had surrendered to the Americans at Yorktown in 1781, but nevertheless, his achievements during that war had made him a hero back at home. So when he came back to London, he was received very warmly, and later, after Warren Hastings resigns, he was offered this responsibility of Governor General of Bengal. Cornwallis accepted it, but he had his own conditions before he did that. And once he accepted and came to India, then he definitely provided a very strong footing for the British rule here in India. In today's session on Modern Indian History series, guys, I, Jawwad Kazi, will be discussing certain key measures of Lord Cornwallis and later that of Lord Richard Wellesley. Now let us start and discuss the period of Lord Cornwallis. Before Cornwallis accepted the responsibility of coming to India as Governor General, he had his own set of conditions also. It was very well known in Britain that Warren Hastings had not, got along with his council. I've told you in my last lecture that the things went on such a downward spiral that one of the member of the council and Warren Hastings had a pistol duel in which the other member was, injured, though not fatally. Lord Cornwallis did not want this sort of a scene. So he put certain conditions before he came to India. And these conditions were approved. What were these conditions? Condition number 1 was that Governor General must have the power to override decisions of his council in special cases, so that he is able to take efficient action, so that he is able to, be the number one player in that council. He insisted upon this and the British Parliament agreed to it. It was incorporated in the Act of 1786. Secondly, he also wanted to be, in addition to Governor General, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army also. A man of great military pedigree, a veteran of multiple wars, and also understanding the delicate situation of EIC in India, he insisted on additionally being the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Now, the reason over here was that before this, the three presidencies had their own separate armies and there was lack of coordination. We saw how that manifested in the First Anglo-Maratha War, with Calcutta and Bombay working at cross purposes. Cornwallis did not want this kind of embarrassment. So he clearly asked for the role of commander-in-chief of the army also. Kindly note, guys, at this point, this was a special measure that was being done for Lord Cornwallis, and it was at this point not to be for all subsequent governor generals. So with these conditions accepted, Lord Cornwallis comes to India. And after coming to India, with great energy, he starts reforming the British governance structure here in India. And one of the major area where he will work, which he will work upon, is the civil services. Lord Cornwallis is often referred to as the father of civil services in British India. Let us see what were the significant measures he took to streamline the civil services of the East India Company back then. Before Lord Cornwallis, the system of civil services was very ad hoc. The court of directors had the privilege of appointing civil servants, and consequently, this privilege was abused. Based on nepotism, favoritism, corruption, and bribes, civil servants were appointed here in India. Lord Cornwallis kept his foot down and stopped this system. He introduced a much more structured civil services. Civil servants henceforth were to have regular appointments and based on merit. These appointments would not be based on the whims and fancies of court of directors. These will be based on the competence of the individual. Of course, back then it was only limited to Europeans, but nevertheless, at least a regular system of civil services is originating due to Cornwallis. By the way, Lord Cornwallis, like many of his peers and later his successors also, he was a man who had a lot of racism. He had a very poor opinion about Indians. He did not believe in their competence, and consequently, in his times, the civil services will be dominated by Europeans alone. It will take a very long time for Indians to get some sort of role in the civil services. He separated the powers of civil servants. Commercial, revenue, and judicial roles, which earlier were fused together in the same individual, were segregated. Remember, guys, these are the times when the French Revolution, is about to begin. And before that, the soil has been prepared by thinkers like Rousseau, other thinkers also. Back then, in the age of enlightenment, the idea of separation of powers had become a very crucial idea. For the inalienable rights which enlightenment promised to every citizen, it was necessary that powers were not concentrated in one hand. The civil services before Cornwallis had concentration of all powers in one individual, and therefore it was required to segregate commercial, revenue, and judicial roles in the civil services, which was done by Cornwallis. Collector, who in addition to his revenue responsibilities, earlier was also discharging judicial functions. Remember, during Warren Hastings' times, he was overseeing the district level courts. In case of civil cases, he was directly sitting there. In case of criminal cases, he was overseeing it. Now, this was detrimental for the interest of justice. So he is now divested of his judicial role, and in his place, a separate cadre of district judges will be created. The problem of bribes and corruption was rampant in the East India Company civil services. Lord Cornwallis objectively tried to understand the reason behind it. And to his perception, he felt that this was because of the low salary that civil servants were getting. And naturally, it compelled them to, indulge in other malpractices. Therefore, he increased the salary of civil servants and also promised them 1% share in the revenue they collected. So there was an incentive for good behavior. Increase salary so that people of integrity will not be compelled because of financial constraints to indulge into anything wrong. He forbade very strictly taking of bribes and gifts from the subjects. While leaving India, these civil servants had to declare their property. Just like we have in our government systems these days, when you enter the service and when you retire, you have to give a declaration of your assets. And in fact, there is a rule that every year this declaration has to be made. Now, this somewhere can be traced back to the measure that Lord Cornwallis took. Based on the kind of salary that the civil servant enjoyed, it would be very clear whether he had made disproportionate gains or no. Most of the civil servants before this went back super duper rich. We have discussed about Lord Clive in our previous session, guys. To prevent this sort of things to happen, Lord Cornwallis introduced this measure. Indians, on the other hand, unfortunately, were not allowed on higher posts. The higher post or the covenanted civil services was reserved only for Europeans. In this manner, Lord Cornwallis took certain steps and measures to streamline the civil services of East India Company. Along with civil services, he also focused on policing reforms. Back then, law and order had become a major challenge in Bengal. There were constant cases of loots and dacoities. Remember, this is the context of a Bengal ruined because of British policies. The Great Famine had washed away 1/3 of Bengal's population. Peasantry was uprooted, agriculture was stagnant. In such times, definitely looting and all such activities, they increase manifold. Cornwallis looked at it from law and order prism also. He felt that some energetic steps are required to get back things under control. For this purpose, he abolished the powers of zamindars to discharge law and order related functions. Right from medieval times, we have seen, guys, that zamindars at local level, they used to discharge law and order related functions also. It was their duty to ensure that there was peace, there was no dacoity, murder, etc., all of these things. If something happened, then strong rulers like Sher Shah Soor used to hold the local zamindar responsible. These powers were there with these local elites. Lord Cornwallis found that these zamindars were actually the source of the problem in many cases. And therefore, law and order would never be, smooth. For this reason, he abolished these powers of zamindars and instead created a modern police force. He created several police stations, or what were called as thanas, at regular intervals. These police thanas were headed by daroga. So he is in charge of the policing duties of that particular area. Daroga. The word daroga, it conjures an image of a very powerful local law and order related officer even to this date in India. The origin of that is here in Lord Cornwallis's times. Many of these police stations coming together made an area called as circle. Over several police stations, a circle is spread, and this circle was headed by an officer called as Superintendent of Police, SP. Superintendent of Police. So this post of Superintendent of Police, SP, that I'm sure many of you aspire for, is actually the creation of Lord Cornwallis's times, SP. He increased their salary, defined their roles and responsibilities, and ensured that British India or East India Company's areas got a more efficient policing system. So this is a very fundamental contribution of Lord Cornwallis in terms of developing policing system in India. And in case you also want to become a police officer, an IPS, then for you, we have a great announcement. UPSC P2I batch, prelims to interview batch for 2025's attempt has already started, guys, on 16th of September. This is your chance to enroll for a batch that will help you to pace your preparation based on your needs. You may be a working aspirant or a student who is still pursuing studies and are targeting 2025's attempt, then P2I long-term batch is the solution for you. This batch, which will run over the 2 years period, will shape your preparation in such a manner that you can optimize the time that you have and prepare effectively for the 2025's attempt. It includes classroom teaching, notes, study material, books like the one we are using right now for this session, Modern Indian History, and a lot more. To ensure that you don't feel low during your preparation, you have access to experienced mentors with whom you can connect to ensure that your preparation is on the right track. Every day you get mains questions to write answers, weekly tests, a full test series for prelims and mains, and a lot of other benefits. This is a one-stop solution batch, guys, for all of your preparation needs. Make the most of this opportunity before it is too late and enroll for this batch using my code JDLive. You can get a handsome discount on the course by using my code. Also, to download my notes, you can reach out to my channel, Jawwad Kazi UPSC Preparation, on the Telegram. Well, with police reforms discussed, now let us see the next set of important reforms that Lord Cornwallis will bring in. To the credit of Warren Hastings, he tried to structuralize the judiciary in India. He segregated the civil and criminal matters and created an appellate system. But nevertheless, this judicial system of Warren Hastings had many limitations. It was still not based on some concrete modern principles of jurisprudence. In that context, Lord Cornwallis's reforms are very significant in case of judiciary also. Let us see what Lord Cornwallis has done. Lord Cornwallis moved the Sadar Diwani and Sadar Nizamat Adalat to Calcutta. Now, these were the main topmost, hierarchical posts in hierarchical courts in the judiciary system. Sadar Diwani Adalat dealing with civil cases and Sadar Nizamat Adalat dealing with criminal cases. He established 4 circuit courts. Circuit courts are established for the purpose of, appeal. Since back then, East India Company in Bengal was ruling over a massive territory. It was crucial to make justice accessible also. So below the top-notch courts, below that he also created circuit courts for appeal for criminal cases. Apart from this, 4 Diwani courts were also created at Patna, Dhaka, Murshidabad, and Calcutta. In these 4 places, you had provincial courts so that civil matters could be taken from districts to these courts before they can be escalated to the Sadar Diwani Adalats. Post of district judge was created. As we saw, collector was divested of his responsibility in terms of judiciary, and instead district judges posts were created. He changed the witness law also. Earlier in the Indian systems, witness law was based on the religion and caste of the person giving testimony, giving witness. He made all witnesses equal before the law. So the principle that developed in Europe, Britain and France particularly, of equality was being made applicable here. Rigorous imprisonments were to be used. In case you are a fan of movies, you might have heard in old Bollywood movies that the judge finally says, Umr qaid ba mashakkat. Okay? Umr qaid ba mashakkat means life imprisonment with hardship. So rigorous imprisonment was an idea that he brought in instead of torture-based methods. In traditional Indian criminal justice system, torture-based methods were often used. Like, for example, if somebody had committed a crime, then his hand would be chopped off or leg would be chopped off and something like that. But instead of that, rigorous imprisonment-based, more humane type of systems were brought in. Governor General was given the power to commute the sentences also. So something that we have in our constitution also today, where the president has the power to commute. That idea in embryonic stage can be seen here in Cornwallis's judicial reforms. Thus, principle of equity and justice were prioritized in judiciary, and secular law was codified instead of religion-based laws. Two important principles that are now foundational to judicial system in British times will be rule of law, that everybody is equal before the law, and equality before the law. These significant principles, which are also values of our constitution, were brought in during British times. Now, practically speaking, of course, there was always the discrimination between Indians and Europeans. The judicial system was always tilted in favor of Europeans. But at least for the sake of an academic argument, we can say that the system was based on these principles. Now, after this, we'll see the ideas of Cornwallis Code. What were the ideas that Cornwallis Code implemented in India? Principle of sovereignty of law. Traditionally speaking, in India, the rulers, the elites, the nobles, they enjoyed a superior status, and consequently, they were always above law. Law was always different for the elites and for the commoners. And in that context, Cornwallis's Code brought about a remarkable change by ensuring principle of sovereignty of law, that is, nobody is above the law. Take the case of Warren Hastings. Okay, to the credit of these principles that emerge in the West, Warren Hastings, after having played a stellar role for the East India Company, he was still subjected to a process of impeachment. He was tried, he had to produce evidence, testimonies were taken, and then after that only he was pronounced not guilty. So these ideas were now being implemented in India. No matter how high your rank is, you are not above the law. Revenue and justice administration were segregated. The role of revenue and justice was different, and very often, if the same person was heading the judiciary also, it would naturally lead to biases. For that reason, clear segregation was required, separation was required. That was ensured. Europeans were now subjected to the jurisdiction of the same law. Okay, they will also be tried under the same law. All government officials would be held accountable for the decisions that they have taken, the acts that they have done in their official capacity. So government officials cannot be insulated from the consequences of their work. They could also be taken to the courts for the actions that they have done. While this was intended earlier also, but during Warren Hastings' times, because of pressure from the EIC officials, they were exempted from the application of this principle. But Lord Cornwallis, ensured that this was implemented. Codification of Hindu and Muslim personal laws was also done during this period, so that the civil matters or personal matters of these two respective communities could be dealt with efficiently. So these were the principles of Cornwallis Code. Now let us see the revenue reforms of Lord Cornwallis, and this is going to be very significant. As I've told you guys in previous lectures also, any Governor General during this period who is taking office will be faced by this challenge of streamlining the revenue of East India Company, because that is what the company was primarily created for ensuring ROI, return on investment, for its investors. And for this purpose, Cornwallis takes up the task of revenue reforms very energetically. He divided Bengal into fiscal areas. The word fisc basically deals with tax. So fiscal areas from where revenue was going to be mobilized, Bengal is divided into such multiple fiscal areas. Each fiscal area was under the charge of one collector. The responsibility of the collector, as the name suggests, is to collect the revenue from that fiscal area. So one fiscal area, one collector appointed over it. These collectors will be under Board of Revenue, which earlier was called as Committee of Revenue. Okay, these collectors will be under Board of Revenue. This Board of Revenue was tasked with keeping a watch over collectors. Zamindars were recognized as owners of land. This is a very crucial decision that Lord Cornwallis made. We have to understand the import of this completely. Zamindars were now made owners of land. Zamindar, the Persian word, zameen is land and dar means, wala, zameen wala. Now, traditionally speaking, India always had this zamindari element. Who were the zamindars? Zamindars were local elites who had the responsibility of collecting revenue from their areas and depositing it with the state officials. During Mughal times, they would collect the revenue from their village, for example, and deposit it with the state officials. There is an Amil who is appointed for collection of revenue. So Zamindar collects it and hands it over to the Amil. For this responsibility that they discharged, they were allowed to retain a certain share of the revenue collected. That was the reason why they did this. Number one, economic motive is the state allowed a share in that revenue to the zamindar. Apart from this, being a zamindar also entailed a lot of social privileges. They had a higher status in the society, and very often this status was abused to make other people pay for their personal land's revenues, make other people work for them for free, so on and so forth. So this kind of structure of zamindar had been there in India, during medieval times. But there was a catch. And that catch was that this zamindar was not the absolute owner of the land. He was not the absolute owner of the land. He only had a right of collecting revenue from the peasants. It was not as if the land exclusively belonged to him. This was in complete contrast to England. In England, the landlord was the absolute owner of the land. So like you own a property, you decide whether that property is to be rented out to somebody or no. You have the rights to kick out that person from that property. So the landlord in England was having similar rights, like he is the absolute owner and he will decide whether to keep somebody on rent or no. And whenever he wants, he can kick out the person from his property. That was the concept in England. But in case of India, the zamindar did not have that sort of exclusive rights. He had some privileges like collecting the revenue, keeping a share for himself, having an elevated status in the society, but not absolute owner of the land. Lord Cornwallis, either out of confusion or out of need for convenience, he declared that zamindar will be the absolute owner of the land. This was a very far-reaching measure. It will have grave consequences for centuries to come for Indian peasants. This decision, with one stroke of the pen, the peasants who were cultivating the farmlands now became tenants at the mercy of the zamindar. Any moment the zamindar could kick out, as the state recognized him as the owner. He is the owner, he can do anything with his property. This decision was taken by Lord Cornwallis. Based on this decision, the state, that is East India Companies, East EIC state, entered into a 10-year settlement with the zamindars in 1790. 10-year settlement. What is this 10-year settlement? For 10 years, these people fixed basically that this is the amount of revenue every year that you are going to pay to the state. For next 10 years, the zamindar is going to pay, say, 110 rupees. 110 rupees to whom? It is going to pay 110 rupees to the state. This was the idea, guys, basically. Okay. Now we will go detail into this concept of permanent settlement shortly. This settlement was made permanent in 1793. Earlier it was only for how many years? Only for 10 years. But later it is made what? Permanent. Now understand the reason or rationale of EIC behind this. What does EIC want? EIC wants stability of revenue. It wants clarity as to how much revenue we are going to get and be relatively assured about it. By making the zamindar the owner, that is giving him the power, and entering into a settlement with the zamindar, from EIC perspective, they got clarity as to how much revenue they are going to get over the next several years. But then this would have very detrimental effects for the peasants, for Indian agriculture, and ultimately in the long run to Indian economy and society. How that will affect? Now we are going to discuss that. Permanent settlement of 1793 as implemented by Lord Cornwallis and Sir John Shore. Sir John Shore was a revenue official of East India Company. He had assisted Warren Hastings also during his revenue related experiments, and later he did the same role for Lord Cornwallis. After Lord Cornwallis goes, he will become the next Governor General of Bengal, Sir John Shore. Now let us see the aspects of permanent settlement. In 1790, East India Company fixed the revenue of a zamindari area based on the base of 1765. From 1765, that is where dual government period starts. East India Company has records. Based on what was being paid in 1765, they arrived at an amount as to what should be paid in 1790. And this land revenue was fixed, that this area is going to pay us, say, for example, 110 rupees to the East India Company. Initially for 10 years, as we noted, later it was made permanent. That is, forever, this land revenue which has been fixed in 1790, that will be the amount that will be paid perpetually to the East India Company by the zamindar. Why will the zamindar pay? Because he has now been recognized as owner of the land. Since he is now owner of the land, he is responsible to pay the tax to the state. Just like if you have a flat, you pay the property tax to the municipal corporation or whatever the entity, local self-government body there might be in your area. The tenant does not pay you the property tax. The tenant pays you rent. You earn rent, and out of that, a small amount you're going to pay as property tax. So similarly over here, zamindar is the owner of the land, and peasants on the land are now what? They are his tenants. Those tenants are going to pay rent to the zamindar. So if we put it like this, at top you have East India Company. Below East India Company, you have the zamindar, and below the zamindar, you have the tenants, who are the peasants basically. These tenants are going to pay zamindar rent. Rent will be paid to them. And zamindar in return is going to pay revenue. Revenue to East India Company. This is the whole idea. Now, since this zamindar is the owner of the land now, unlike earlier when only he had the rights of collection, now he is absolute owner. Therefore, he can now evict the farmers or peasants. He can kick them out at his will. I hope you got this. Now, East India Company figured out what was the amount that can be derived as revenue in 1790 based on figures of 1765. Now, let us assume that that amount was, say, 110 rupees for the sake of ease of calculation. Out of this 110 rupees, 10 by 11 of it, that is 100 rupees, will go to EIC. And 1 by 11, that is 10 rupees, will be retained by the zamindar. This was the sharing pattern or formula that they arrived at. I hope you got this, guys. Zamindar was also given additional ownership of non-agricultural produce of the land also. Like for example, if there is some forested area, and in that forested area there are other resources, like for example, you'll have some honeybees there. Okay, so collection of honey, that is also zamindar's rights. There might be tendu leaves that can be used for beedi making. Those tendu leaves are also zamindar's property. There might be a pasture land in that area which was used by the common villagers. That pasture land also belongs to the zamindars. So the zamindar has become extremely powerful. Why is he being made powerful? So that he can pay this revenue to the state. East India Company is not concerned with what happens to the individual peasant or farmer. It only wants its revenue, and for that reason this zamindar is made very powerful. But having made him powerful, they also made him accountable to EIC. On a particular date of the year, this zamindar had to come and compulsorily deposit this 100 rupees. Failure to do that would lead to his eviction. Zamindar himself would lose his zamindari, and that zamindari would be auctioned and given to somebody else. Bengal, Bihar, Orissa were the areas, initial areas where this system was implemented and later extended to eastern Uttar Pradesh and northern Tamil Nadu also. Okay. Now, what were the consequences or significance of this? 19% of British India would be under permanent settlement. So the first settlement is zamindari. Later on, others will come, which we will see in due course. But initially, it is only in those areas where early rule is established by EIC. So overall, at the time of independence, you can say 19% of British India was under this system. Peasant now became the tenant, and he suffered because of the high assessment that was done by the zamindar. The zamindar wanted to extract the maximum so that he could fulfill the demand of the East India Company. East India Company did not care about what was happening because of droughts and famines. It only wanted stability of its revenue. And for that reason, zamindar was pressurized. And what would the zamindar do? He pressurized the tenants. No remissions were given in worst of times also. Consequently, a lot of eviction of tenants was happening. They were being kicked out and new ones were being brought in. And at the same time, a lot of zamindars also lost their zamindari rights. When they were not able to pay, then these people lost their right to somebody else. Because of this constant demand to pay land revenue at a high cost, there was a need for credit in the countryside, in the rural areas. And we'll see in this period, a lot of money lenders will penetrate into the rural areas. Now guys, remember traditionally we always had this money lending class in India. From ancient times, we get reference of money lenders in India. But it was during this period that from cities, these money lenders went into rural areas. Now, if you go to any village in India, you will see that there will be one family at least of rural money lender. The penetration of this class happened during British times because of this increasing indebtedness. Increasing indebtedness ultimately led to poverty. Just imagine that character Bhuvan from Lagan, where Captain Russell is asking them to pay the tax or Lagan to East India Company. Now, what will Bhuvan do initially? He will first try to sell off his wife's jewelry, his mother's jewelry, and pay off the revenue. Maybe 1 year that works. What in the second year? Second year, again, he does not have money to pay the high demand of revenue. What will he do? He will go to the local baniya and he will ask for loan to pay this Lagan. Increased intermediaries. This is a crucial point. Very often when the local zamindar who was from that village, who belonged to that same kinship, he was not as cold and heartless. Therefore, he did not pressurize the peasants that badly. So consequently, he was not able to give the revenue to EIC. His rights were taken away and auctioned. In that auction, the next person who will buy the zamindari will not be from that village. That person will be from some distant city, say Calcutta or Dhaka or Murshidabad. Now, this person is an investor who wants to earn returns because he has bought that zamindari. This fellow is not connected with the local community. He is going to continue to live in Calcutta or any of these bigger towns. This creates absentee landlordism, where the landlord was not present on that site in that community. He is a distant figure who has only bought the right as a matter of investment. Now, consequently, this absentee landlord will need somebody on the ground to do the task for him. So what will he do? He will appoint his representatives to do it for him and give a share in that process to those representatives. This chain of the absentee landlord and the representatives between him and the final peasant went on increasing during British times. So much so that our NCERT themes, NCERT tells us that at times there were 11 intermediaries also in this process. So you can imagine each one of these is trying to extract and is trying to, squeeze out the maximum that can be done from the peasants. What will be the impact on the Indian farmer, the peasant at that time? You can imagine. There was complete stagnation in agriculture. Constant famines were taking place. Peasants were revolting and deserting their fields. This was the impact of Lord Cornwallis's permanent settlement. The other two types of settlements are coming up later because they were implemented in subsequent periods. Rayotwari and Mahalwari settlements. I hope you got this, guys. Now let us see other remaining measures of Lord Cornwallis. Lord Cornwallis fought the Tipu Sultan in Third Anglo-Mysore War. Tipu Sultan had attacked Travancore, an ally of East India Company, which led to the Third War, in which Tipu Sultan was defeated. Half of his territory was taken, 3 crores worth of indemnity was levied, and when he was not able to pay, 2 of his sons were taken as hostages by East India Company. And this painting over here represents that scene where Lord Cornwallis is receiving 2 of his sons. So Cornwallis was able to earn a big victory on the most formidable enemy in South India. Second, he established Sanskrit College at Banaras, which is the famous Sanskrit college which is still functional. Earlier, we have seen Warren Hastings established Calcutta Madrasa. That was in context of, understanding Muslim law, particularly criminal law. And here, Sanskrit College is also established so that the Hindu personal laws can also be learnt and studied. The East India Company was very wise in that sense to have a better understanding of the people whom they are ruling. Many of the administrators were scholars and they loved to learn Indian civilizational history, culture, so on and so forth. He took some steps and measures against slavery. Also, slavery was prohibited and anybody practicing it was considered to have broken the law. He established a new mint at Calcutta. So these are a few additional points about Lord Cornwallis that we must know. This concludes our discussion on Cornwallis. After Cornwallis, Sir John Shore, as I mentioned, will take over. But nothing very significant happens in Sir John Shore's time. A very mild-mannered, unassuming kind of Governor General that he was. He did not fight any major war during his period and tried to just, continue the systems as they were designed earlier. So very uneventful type of Governor Generalship we see during Sir John Shore's times. So nothing significant over there. Okay, Lord Cornwallis, he will come back once again in India for a second term much later. He comes back in 1805, but unfortunately for him, he passed away after coming over here and he is buried at a place called as Ghazipur in Uttar Pradesh. So there is a tomb of Lord Cornwallis there in Ghazipur in Uttar Pradesh. All right. Fine. Now we go to the next Governor General of this period who has played a significant role, that is Lord Wellesley. The intervening Governor General was Sir John Shore, about whom I briefly mentioned to you. Now we are going to talk about the great Lord Richard Wellesley, who will be the Governor General from 1799 to 1805. Let us briefly know this guy first, Lord Wellesley. Lord Wellesley came to India with a very clear vision. He was very sure about this. He did not like this Pacific period. Warren Hastings, Cornwallis, Sir John Shore. This period is relatively a Pacific period because EIC is not on the aggressive side. You see, Warren Hastings' times wars, there were always reasons why he had to fight the wars. Okay, it was not as if he was taking the initiative to conquer territory. In case of Cornwallis, there is only one major war, that is with Tipu Sultan. But there too, there was a context. Travancore was attacked and Tipu Sultan in any case was very close to the French. So Cornwallis had to fight that war. Sir John Shore did not fight any significant wars as such at all. And therefore this entire period after, Battle of Buxar is relatively a period where EIC is not very keen on warfare. But by the time it is 1799, EIC has stabilized, structures and systems are in place. Therefore, now a launch pad is ready for the next round of aggression, which will be launched by Lord Richard Wellesley. Richard Wellesley wants to make the EIC supreme power in India. He is an avowed imperialist. He is a declared kind of ideas. He does not make any bones out of it. It's not a secret desire that he has. Very openly he says this. He wants to add as much territory as possible and reduce all Indian states to a position of dependence on the country. Everybody has to be subdued. Okay. He gave a policy of peace and non-intervention, which earlier was being practiced during Sir John Shaw's times. He inaugurates a policy of war, more war, and further wars, as one historian has described. Period of war, more war, and further wars. So you can use this with quotation in your answers. More war, and further wars. Okay. He is also backed by England's war ministry at this point, because simultaneously there in Europe, revolutionary wars are taking place. Napoleon has become extremely powerful. So in that context, now even London is more amenable to the idea of subduing Indian powers. So with this stage set, now we have Lord Wellesley, who calls himself as the Royal Bengal Tiger. Okay, you can't have a more alpha male than this. Cornwallis was a great military general, but then he was a level-headed guy. This guy is like, very aggressive, in your face, ready to take on any challenge, that sort of a person. Okay. Now, and when Wellesley comes, he is also facing a tricky situation with the French. What is happening on the French scene? See, world history is always connected with modern Indian history. What is happening here? Napoleon was sent by the French government. Napoleon was sent by the French government to conquer Egypt and Syria. Napoleon with his force has entered there. He has taken hold of, some parts of Egypt, and he is looking towards India also. Wellesley is threatened. Tipu Sultan had sent envoys to Mauritius, which was French colony. And his envoys had returned with French soldiers and also a promise of help against Lord Wellesley. So this is a big threat. The French again gaining ground over here. Indian chiefs like Mahatma Scindia had employed Frenchmen, although Mahatma by this time has passed away, but then he has modernized his army like anything. And that was on display during the first Anglo-Maratha war also. So Mahatma's armies under French officers like De Boyne and Monsieur Peron, they have created a very powerful modern lines army too. In 1801, Napoleon's alliance with Tsar Paul of Russia. This is very crucial. France and Russia at this point are, literally enemies, sworn enemies of England. France is already fighting, and Russia also wants to advance southwards in the direction of Mediterranean and also in the direction of Central Asia. And Napoleon and the Tsar, they have come to a common understanding. This is a great threat. Two very powerful European rivals coming together, and naturally they are going to eye India. So this is a big threat to Wellesley. Lastly, Nizam of Hyderabad. Nizam of Hyderabad was promised by East India Company that they will help him out whenever Marathas attack him. And for that reason, they had taken a lot of territory and money also from Nizam of Hyderabad. But when finally Marathas attacked him in 1795, Battle of Kharda, Sir John Shore refused to help. Sir John Shore refused to help. He did not want to offend the Marathas at that point. So he did not send any help. Nizam was frustrated, and therefore he started to employ French people again. Most famously, Monsieur Raymond. So he started to employ the French. This naturally is, if I may use with liberty Hindi term, Khatare ki ghanta for Lord Wellesley. Lord Wellesley will have to do something very quickly, and he takes very energetic steps in that direction. What will he do? Let us try to understand that. Okay. So Wellesley wanted control of as much territory as possible without wars. So he uses the idea of Subsidiary Alliance. Subsidiary Alliance. Originally developed by Dupleix during the Carnatic Wars, which we have discussed. He modifies and improvises that idea to gain control over as much territory of Indian powers as possible. It served dual purposes, control over Indian powers and keeping Napoleon out of India. So with this dual intention, Lord Wellesley is going to use Subsidiary Alliance. Now let us see the key principles or provisions of Subsidiary Alliance, guys. This is a very important treaty that Wellesley will sign with many Indian powers. What are the measures? Let us see that. English resident had to be hosted at the court of Indian prince who signed the Subsidiary Alliance. If you become a subsidiary ally of the English, then there will be an English officer who will be posted at your court. He's called as the resident. Warren Hastings was a resident at Murshidabad. Similarly, Bussy, the French officer, was there in Hyderabad. This principle was already established. This resident, when he came, he did not come alone with his suitcase like that. He came with a big tamjham. There were a lot of officials along with him. There was a body of troops to support him. So it was like having a Trojan horse inside the court of the Indian prince. This resident will also come with the British contingent troops at the capital of the Indian prince, ostensibly to protect him, to protect the Indian prince. The Maharaja or Nawab, whoever the case might be, he's told that, see, we are sending this British force at your capital so that in case anybody attacks you, they are ready to come out all guns blazing to fight for you. Okay. Expenses but of these troops were not to be borne by EIC, but by whom? By Indian prince. So East India Company is sending its army at the capital of an Indian prince, and the expense of that is being borne by that Indian prince. Could there be a better thing for the English than this? Their army is being paid for by Indian princes who are actually supposed to fight back the East India Company. Employment of foreigners could be done only with EIC's permission. No more employing French or other Europeans. If you want to employ, you have to seek permission first. No others will be employed apart from East India Company's people who are sent there. War and peace by the Indian prince will be done only with EIC permission. You can fight wars or declare peace only when EIC allows you to. In this manner, guys, the entire sovereignty of Indian prince was violated, and in return the promise was that EIC will protect the Indian prince against any external or internal threat. This is promise number 1, protection. It was a flawed promise. Number 2, it would not interfere, and this was an even bigger lie. It would not interfere in the internal affairs of the Indian prince. It would not interfere in the internal affairs of the Indian prince. They did exactly the opposite of that. The role of the resident was in fact to interfere, to keep a watch, to see the different parties in contention, to get as much intelligence as possible. This was Subsidiary Alliance of Lord Wellesley. Naturally, this alliance gave big advantage to the English. It was Trojan horse tactics. You know that story of Troy? Story of Troy? How that city was overcome during ancient Greek times. It had impregnable walls and many armies attacked but could never win that city. Finally, an army defeated at the walls of that city created a big horse made of wood as a gift, parting gift at the failure of their invasion. People of Troy got that horse inside and started to sing and dance around it like a trophy of their victory. Little did they know that there were soldiers hiding inside that massive horse who came out at the night and opened the doors of the walls of the city. And that is how the enemies could again enter back. So this was like that Trojan horse tactic where you infiltrate, appearing innocuous, and then you play your game. That is the resident's role. Governor General through the resident was present in every Indian state via proxy of resident. So Governor General could now have a watch on what was happening in the courts of several Indian princes, and that too at the cost of those princes only. The resident is being paid for by the Indian prince. It ruled out a possibility of any confederacy against British. Indian princes could have come together and fought against EIC, but of course the residents were vigilant. They were always on the lookout for what is brewing and never allowed this confederacy to come up. It enabled East India Company to maintain a large army at the expenses of Indian prince. Can there be a better thing to do, guys? In 19th century, EIC will have an army of more than 2 lakh soldiers, and that will be twice the army of their motherland. How was that possible? Because Indian princes were paying for these troops stationed at their capitals. Control of strategic and key positions in India. These contingents were there at capitals which were at most important locations in the country. And therefore, it was easy for EIC to move those troops wherever there was need for some fighting. It kept companies' territories and wealth away from actual theatre of war. If at all, a war has to be fought. Like if you see in the first Anglo-Mysore war, Hyder Ali reached right up to Madras capital, Madras's gates. He made them sign a treaty because he had reached their gates. Similarly, in Carnatic wars, the French lost the city of Madras. This would never happen again. Why? Because of Subsidiary Alliance, all the action that will take place, that will be at the courts of Indian princes only, in the territories of Indian princes, not where the company's territories were located. It helped to counteract efficiently and any possible French moves in India. It ensured that the French did not get any space with any of the Indian princes, because everywhere the British residents will ultimately be present. The company became arbiter of disputes amongst Indian states, because everybody will ultimately be a subsidiary ally. So if there is any fight, issues will come to the company only and the company will decide. Just imagine that, guys. All Indian powers so perilously dependent on East India Company, even their fights are being decided by EIC itself. Okay. Patronage. Through influential class of British residents, they were able to secure patronage for East India Company. Lastly, company acquired territories in full sovereignty also. Whenever the Indian princes were not able to pay money to them for maintenance of troops, EIC said, okay, Maharaj, Nawab Sahab, Nizam, no problem. You give us a part of your territory. We will take revenue from there and we will maintain the troops for you. So territories were also added without fighting wars. There can't be anything more than this. There can't be a bigger masterstroke than Subsidiary Alliance. The Indian prince, of course, was at a disadvantage. Corollary of all of this, he virtually lost his independence in this process, was constantly subjected to interference by residents. He was weak and oppressive rulers were supported by EIC. Earlier, the ruler had to respond to people's needs, their subjects' needs. So the Indian prince has to keep his people happy. If the people are unhappy, then there can be a coup, there can be a change in the ruler. But now with EIC's armies there at the capital, the Indian ruler did not have to look for the Indian subjects. He was happy and secure because EIC was there to protect him. Consequently, what happened? People were not having any remedy against misrule by Indian princes. They have to accept what sort of rule they are getting. They say beggars are not choosers. That was the situation, unfortunately, that came for Indian subjects. Subsidiary Alliance also led to financial bankruptcy for Indian princes because of the constant and huge demand that was imposed on them. 1/3 of revenue almost was paid to EIC, and this always could not be met in time, and therefore there were arrears. There was, payments that were pending to the EIC, and because of this, very often territories were also snatched away from Indian princes. Now, to make the most of these arrears, to fulfill the demands of arrears, what will Indian prince do? Naturally, they will not sell off their gems and jewelry to do that. They will continue to have a Majjani life. Instead, they will heavily tax people. They will heavily tax the people, and people will be impoverished in this process. You remember that character Rajaji from the movie Lagan? He is pressed. On one side, there are people of the village, Bhuvan and others, who are begging Rajaji to waive off the Lagan. And on the other side, you have Captain Russell and the English, who are forcing Rajaji to collect the Lagan. So the Indian prince is caught in between in all of this. Naturally, the prince will not, himself bear the burden. He will pass it on to whom? To the Indian subjects, who will be impoverished because of this. Okay. So this was the concept of Subsidiary Alliance. Now let me just tell you briefly how the alliance evolved. In the first stage, company lends its troops to a friendly Indian prince in his wars. Whose wars? Indian prince's war. They are fighting against one another. Company gives troops to him. Take the example of Carnatic wars. Okay. Treaty with Nizam in 1768 is an example of this. Nizam wants to fight the Marathas or defend against Marathas. EIC promises, okay, we will give you troops. You give us money. We'll station it at your headquarters. In the second stage, Now the company has evolved. Company troops will fight in war for common causes. Here it was for the cause of Indian prince. Second stage, they both have some common cause and they fight for it. This is second stage. Third stage, Indian ally not to supply men but only money. Don't fight. Completely leave it to us. Instead, just give us money. This is what EIC demands. Treaty with Hyderabad in 1798 finally. So the Indian prince will not have army anymore on any significant scale. He will be totally dependent on East India Company's army, and EIC says, see, you outsource this job for us. Why do you want to do this boring task? We are here to do all the hard work, take the risk for you. Just give us what? Just give us money. And whenever that huge amount of money could not be paid, it led to arrears. And whenever there were arrears, it brought about the next stage, the fourth stage. In fourth stage, Indian state did not give money. Instead, it surrendered territory. So here money was being paid. In this next stage, territory will be given, and this territory will then be used to support the troops that were required for the defense of that Indian prince, technically speaking. Practically, we know all of that was being done for East India Company's interest only. So this was the brilliant masterstroke that Richard Wellesley would implement, and in that process, he became successful in bringing many Indian princes under British control. Here is a list of them: 1798 Hyderabad, Mysore, Tanjore, Awadh, Maratha Peshwa, Sindhia, Gaikwad, Bhosle, Holkar. These are all significant players of that period who came under Subsidiary Alliance of the British. So you can imagine, guys, the kind of success this policy of Lord Wellesley had. All major Indian players of that time, barring of course Punjab and that area, because EIC has not yet reached there, but major Indian players are Subsidiary Allies of the British. Lastly, Lord Wellesley's few other contributions. He created the Fort William College in 1800. His goal was, when civil servants come to India, because they were recruited there in England, and when they come to India, they should be having a labasna for them over here, a place where they will be trained in Indian history, culture, language, so on and so forth, so that they can become good administrators. That was the whole goal of it. Indian languages were taught in this college. Also, there was an extensive translation department created so that Indian texts, old Indian texts, could be translated into English, and Europeans, particularly the administrators, will have a better understanding of these texts, and from that, Indian society, history, culture, so on and so forth. Modern prose development in Indian languages will also take place because of Fort William College. India, of course, had a history of, drama, poetry, epics, so on and so forth. But then modern prose, that was lacking in Indian languages also. That will develop over here in this college. Although Wellesley intended this to be the labasna for EIC's civil servants, the company officials there, the court of directors, did not like this idea, and therefore the training college as such was shifted back to England. Haileybury College was established there, where the civil servants were trained and then sent to India. Nevertheless, the college continued to remain as a language training center for the next 50 years, till revolt of 1857. So this is one more contribution of Lord Wellesley that we must know. That concludes our session for today, guys. If you've liked this session, found it useful, then do like this video, share it with your friends, and also leave some love in the comment box. I'll see you in my next lecture tomorrow. Thank you.